Thank you, and welcome back to the final session for today, which is on child death classification, issues for the future of analysis and reporting. This session is for professionals and researchers working in child death classification. It provides essential information to support decision makers planning the transition from the International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems, version 10, ICD-10, and the implementation of the classification system ICT-11. It also identifies impacts of the revised population estimates from the 2021 census, particularly for First Nations populations. To start the session, I would like to welcome James Enstone-Hinkins and Lauren Moran from the ABS to talk about ICD-11. Over to you, Lauren and James.
Okay. Thanks so much, Jamie. Well, I'll kick off as we go through. And thank you for having us. I'm going to start the session off mostly by talking through what we currently do, because I know that there's quite a lot the child death review teams, but as we've been going through the ICD-11 process, there has been quite a lot of focus on the national mortality data set, those data flows, and how any changes in classification would be affected by what comes through. So as we go through, so I'll get you just to go straight into the next slide, James. So you've got lots of time to talk about ICD-11 and the changes. So that's where I really will cover off the national mortality data set. I'll try and really focus around those child deaths, and please bring in those links with the child death review teams as well. And then we'll just start going into the ICD-11 classification. So if we go into the next slide, so as the National Statistical Organisation, the ABS produces regular outputs on deaths in Australia, and child deaths are obviously a subset of those. So our key data source is the Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages in each state. In particular, for the causes of death, we use the Medical Certificate of Cause of Death, the Medical Certificate of Cause of Perinatal Death, and we also have a lot of information from the coroner database, which is going to be really important for consideration as we really start to go through ICD-11 and some of the opportunities and change coming there. And of course, we do use ICD-10 currently. We've been using that since 1997. Over that time, though, it hasn't been static. We've often looked for opportunity. Some recent changes with ICD-10, for example, is coding in risk factors for children. So that's not just for things such as suicide, but it is also for deaths of children at home where there may be some social or environmental risk factors present. And it's really about how do we take these enhancements that we've already been making with ICD-10 into the future with a more developed classification. And as I mentioned before, we really do produce a whole suite of products. The annual causes of death publication and the annual deaths publication is where we have our largest focus on child mortality, really because of that large referral to the coroner in the child deaths, but we do put out various outputs as well on provisional counts of death and excess mortality in Australia. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to focus a little bit on some of the data sources that we have. So I mentioned that we have the Medical Certificate of Cause of Death and the Medical Certificate of Perinatal Cause of Death. Oh, we have two. Do you want me to share my screen? James is actually, he's on a boat, so I think we were always worried this would be a little shaky. Yeah, sure, that's fine. Let me, if I just pull up.
Okay.
Oh, he's back. Oh, okay, thanks, James. So we do have those two sources. Yeah, we can see it, James. Yeah. And we don't receive any changes or updates to the medical certificate of cause of death. We just accept the doctor's best medical opinion. And most of the codes we're applying there would be what every people who use ICD-10 know as the P chapter or the Q chapter. So conditions originating in the perinatal period are very common, and congenital conditions present at birth. But when we're accessing the National Coronial Information System, we are using the police report, toxicology report if necessary, the autopsy and the coronial findings, and building a really rich picture of what has happened at a child's death, or at anybody's death for that matter. And we're applying codes. Some of those are risk factor codes, and others of those are the underlying cause of death. So what actually caused the death? And this will be quite a big change as we see some things that are enhanced in ICD-11 that James will take us through a little bit later. As part of that, we also have a unit record data set as well that's available to researchers with the codes on them. So if we go to the next slide, please. So just before we start talking about ICD-11 and having that understanding of our current processes in mind, I just wanted to highlight a few things around certifier type, because the types of inputs and source data that we get will be really important for coding in ICD-11. So you can child deaths are certified by a doctor, so that's over 60%, but it's a really large change when we look at infants versus those aged between 1 to 17. So because infants, we have that high mortality in the perinatal period, we do have more doctor certified deaths, so there's probably less opportunity for change in this space. But where we start looking at these coroner referred deaths, so in that over 1 to 17, and really it's anything over 1 month, that we are going to see a change in the way that we're applying the classification. And just to the next slide, I've just put up a slide as well of the leading causes of deaths that the ABS publishes in Australia, and this is for 2021. And James will talk through particularly some of these categories. So we can see that the infant deaths and being affected by maternal conditions is the #1 cause of death. But SUDI, SIDS, and other unexplained mortality in childhood, we do have also 138 deaths each year, and there's really large changes here. And then we also have suicide as the leading cause of death in people aged 5 to 17. And there is a lot of opportunity for change in the way that we capture and report on the depth of information for policy that will change in ICD-11. So that hopefully sets the scene as to what we do as the ABS, and hopefully some crossover with data sources for the child death review teams, as James then goes into ICD-11 and some of the opportunities and change coming up.
All right, thank you very much, Lauren, and apologies everyone for losing the connection there for a minute. Hopefully we can power through to the end from here. So yes, ICD-11, it is a very long-standing project that the WHO have run. It has taken more than a decade to develop ICD-11, and I imagine that some people may have even been involved in the topic advisory groups, which contributed to the changes across the ICD that will come in 11. But just as a sort of quick introduction to it, ICD-11 differs from previous versions of this classification in the sense that it is made up of a foundation layer, like a terminology. It contains a very, very large array of diseases and conditions. And that foundation is it is used to draw code sets which can be used for different purposes. So the one that people would most commonly use would be the mortality and morbidity statistics code set. And that is going to be used as a basis for statistics around the world, WHO member states. So that will look most like ICD-10. There are a few even with the mortality and morbidity statistics code set, in that there chapters. So there's the immune system chapter, sleep-wake disorders, conditions related to sexual health. There is a traditional medicine chapter, and there are extension codes, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. So as I say, the code set, the MMS code set, more or less mirrors ICD-10, but it is, of course, updated from a medical scientific perspective, and it will differ in some way with a slightly different chapter structure. But the main thing that we will have to get our heads around using is extension codes. So extension codes is a whole new chapter. It contains already literally thousands of potential extensions, which allow for codes to be further specified. And that further specification can be in any number of ways. Extension codes will not necessarily have the same level of governance around them that the STEM codes in the MMS will have. So there's a very rigorous process in a minute for updating components of the ICD, but for extension codes where they add value, there is much more flexibility to be able to add those to the classification. Of course, what we will be able to do with this combination of codes is to put together STEM and extension codes, or in some cases STEM and STEM codes, into clusters that further define a particular disease or condition, and that will do far more than what we can do with the codes that we use alone at the moment. So basically, when it comes to mortality data, there are lots of opportunities. Internationally, it's being considered as to how we will use extension codes, but it is almost certain that in different countries, we will use them slightly differently. Just to give you an example here, this is a code from the mortality and morbidity statistics classification for a neoplasm of the brain. And effectively, what you can see on this slide is that there is the ability to also use extension codes to specify the specific anatomy of where this neoplasm is. There is also the ability to choose from a very broad list of histopathology and talk about things like manifestations if needed, in this case, most likely for a morbidity perspective. So from the point of view of looking to implement ICD-11, there's absolutely no doubt this is going to herald a new generation of health statistics. And there are lots of expectations of ICD-11. I know the World Health Assembly meeting is on around now, and there is a very large push at the moment to ensure that there's interoperability is the right word between terminologies such as SNOMED and the ICD, so that we can start looking at medical terms and translating them very easily into ICD codes. And with the additional detail that we can add, there are definitely some examples in Australia where that would be very helpful. And a few of those, the drug codes. So at the moment, the ICD only covers broad classification of drugs and some individual drugs. But in ICD-11, there will be a complete drug classification that sits behind and can be incredibly detailed and allow us to capture information far beyond what we can do right now. Lauren mentioned risk factors, which are really important for coding and coding of child deaths. So they will be able to be specified again in far more detail. And we've just talked about things like anatomy and histopathology. The other thing that will be a big opportunity with ICD-11 is that as an electronic classification, there will be far better opportunity to be able to integrate with electronic tools. So things like electronic medical certificates of cause of death, the integration there will be an opportunity, as will its ability to link in with auto coding software. So lots of work internationally underway right now in that space. There will also be quite a number of challenges in trying to get this into place. So effectively, things like the infrastructure that we need for it, this is a more complex way of capturing and storing data. We will need better infrastructure to be able to use ICD-11. And internationally, we need to work through things like bridge coding exercises so that we can guide users through the transition when that actually occurs. So it will likely cause a number of breaks in series. So national reporting, we will do lots of work to ensure that people can bridge between classifications, but they will still have to do so despite breaks in series. And there will be lots of challenges trying to manage getting this in place across different elements of the health system. And it's very likely that there will be a staged approach to ICD-11 adoption, although that's still being worked through at the moment. There's a training aspect to it, and of course there will be costs. So we need to ensure that this is a priority, and it's going to be something where I think there will be quite a need for advocacy to be able to ensure that it is given the priority it needs to get in place. So just moving on to some of the specific changes. Um, the Mortality Reference Group is a WHO committee that is responsible for maintenance and updates to the ICD from that mortality use case perspective. And there is opportunity either for the MRG to propose updates or changes to the classification or the reference guide, which describes how we use the classification. But that group also provides feedback on all ICD related proposals, some impact on mortality. So we want to make sure that we can continue to use the classification for that key use case. So the mortality reference group has a big job, and at the moment it has a really large job and role to play as countries are working through ICD-11 adoption plans. There are lots of things that are required for fine-tuning of the classification, and there's still opportunity for people to influence in some areas. So there are definitely still proposals occurring. And all of those go through a very rigorous process, as I mentioned earlier, before they are adopted. There's quite a lengthy schedule for updates, but that's something that we're working on at the moment with WHO, because there are definitely still some opportunities for changes to be implemented. So just a couple more slides to go. In terms of something that would, of course, be of great interest to people here on this conference today, is changes to the categories for sudden infant death syndrome. So at the moment, ICD-11 still mirrors ICD-10 from a structure perspective. And you can see on the right-hand side, the MH11 sudden infant death syndrome codes. There are just the split between with mention of autopsy and without mention of autopsy. But we know that there has been quite a strong push in the way that these deaths are understood and the way that we would like to be capturing information about the investigation. So the MRG have been working a couple of proposals that have received that are seeking quite significant change in this space. I think it's a very complex area, and we've only very recently had some further discussions on this. We do need to be able to use classification to the information that is available in many countries can be quite limited and still needs to be able to be captured and placed appropriately with classification. But one of the key things that we have at the moment as an issue is that many deaths end up being coded to other ill-defined and unspecified causes of mortality, and there is an opportunity to not only be able to capture these unexpected infant deaths in one group, but also to be able to capture that in a way that allows us to then specify what was found in the investigation of those deaths, if anything. So while we've got definitely a lot of work still to do to enact change here, there is definitely support for some of these broad principles in making changes in this part of the classification. So as I mentioned, putting the being able to classify the deaths in one group together, being able to retain a category for sudden infant death syndrome as it is stated. So it may be through a death certificate or through a coronial investigation, but trying to use that in its use where other things have been excluded, and to be able to then separately classify deaths which are described as sudden unexplained deaths of an infant or other variations of those terms. And I understand that there would be a number of additional synonyms or index terms that would potentially be captured outside of SIDS. We still need to work through whether or not the mention of autopsy would be included in the base structure, but there is potential to use extension codes to say what was known about this death, including the investigation into this death, and extension codes could also be added to allow capture of information on things like intrinsic or extrinsic factors that were identified through death investigation. So as I mentioned, lots of things that still need to be worked through in terms of how this might be structured, but there has been a lot of interest, both from the New South Wales Ombudsman had put forward a proposal. There is another from the Radcliffe Group that some of you may have heard of. And there is a revision to all of those at the moment, and hopefully a path forward coming up. I'm going to finish there. I'm sure there will be some questions later on. If I stop sharing and hand back, thank you for listening.
Soon, I'm sure. Look, we're on to our last presentation of the day, and so I'd now like to welcome Rosalind Gittins and Edwin Lee from the Queensland Government Statistician's Office. They're going to talk a little bit about the impact of the 2021 census data on population estimates. Over to you, Rosalind and Edwin.
Thanks very much, Shane. And I'm going to lead off, and Edwin's going to follow in a little later. So today we're going to talk about a quick summary of some information that you may well already know, which relates to the recent release by the ABS of the preliminary Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population estimates for 30th of June 2021. And they were released in September last year, so it might seem like old news. These are estimates that are part of the regular schedule of releases by the ABS following each census of population and housing, and they provide the basis for the rebasing of historical estimates and the production of a consistent time series of estimates and projections for use in reporting. So you might wonder why we're so interested in the release, given it's part of the regular schedules, and this lies around the fact that the 2021 release is significantly higher than was projected, and that has impacts on reporting for numerous indicators for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population at the local, state and territory and national level. This impact won't, however, be seen until that full time series is released in the middle of next year. But in the meantime, all agencies are continuing to report on the old time series based on the 2016 census data. So I'm just going to give a quick potted history on how the 30th of June population estimates are produced. And that's the ABS is taking the census counts, then they adjust for net undercount or overcount, and then they make some additional adjustments for residents temporarily overseas and for backdating of births and deaths. So removing births that have occurred after the 1st of July up until the census date and adding back in deaths. And then that provides the basis for producing the preliminary estimate, which we have at the moment. And then they will revise that again for a final estimate, which is due out in August this year. So as I said earlier, our interest lies around the size, both numeric, the increase between 2016 and 2021 in both numerically and proportionally. And you can see that the census count at the national level went up by over 25%, or 163,000 people. And that compares with the 18% increase in the census count between 2011 and 2016. So it's notably bigger. And also, if we look at the Greater Capital City and rest of state, you can see that growth was faster in the Greater Capital City areas than in the rest of state areas. So, and just for a quick comparison, wrong way. If we take the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander count out of the total population, then the rest of the Australian population count increased by around just over 8%. So you can see it's significantly different. So there's a number of reasons for the increase in the census count of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, and these are fairly well known. So we've got the standard demographic factors, the births, deaths, and migration, both overseas and in the case of jurisdictional populations, interstate. And the remaining increase lies around these non-demographic factors of identification mobility, so people changing or choosing to identify differently at different time points, and also an increased propensity to identify, and obviously the actual quality of the census itself in terms of collecting data on this population. So this is unashamedly just a snip from the ABS release, Understanding Changes in the Count. And I'll put this up there just to show you that the increase between 2016 and 2021, more than half of that was non-demographic. So more than half of the increase couldn't be explained by the standard demographics of births, deaths and migration, which is quite significant, and a large increase from the 2011 to 2016 census jump. So I'm going to have a quick look at the shift in identification change. So people can choose, or someone may choose on their behalf, how that they will identify in a census. And we had a look at the Australian census longitudinal data set to get this information. It's not available for 2021 yet. So we've got 2011 on the left-hand side and 2016 on the right-hand side. And we're looking at the status that people have identified in 2011 on the left, and then if that's changed on the right-hand side, because people do choose to identify differently at different points in time. So you can see that the largest flow is for those consistently identifying as Aboriginal. And then of those that did change their identification status, the largest flow there is from non-Indigenous to Aboriginal. But there were also flows from all of the Indigenous categories to non-Indigenous and vice versa. So there's actually quite a lot of movement occurring. And I should just state that that's for Queensland, but you'll also see very similar, although smaller, Torres Strait Islander numbers for the rest of Australia. So we can break this down a little bit more and look at across 3 census periods, so 2006, 11 and 16. And you can see from this chart that nearly 7 in 10 consistently identified across all 3 censuses, and that just over 1 in 10 identified in an earlier census but chose not to in 2016. So again, we're seeing people's individuals' choice of whether they identify or not and how they identify. And then around 9% that were newly identified, so added into the count in 2011 and 2016. So having looked at those census counts quite quickly, we'll have a look at the population estimates, which is what is really going to affect the reporting. So as I said, the census counts are used to create the estimates. So this is the plot of the estimates and projections for the 3 subsequent censuses, 2006, 11 and 16. And the right-hand end of the solid line is where the estimate for the census year is. And you can see that for each time, the subsequent census year has been notably higher. And the 2021 dot there, which is where roughly the solid line will end for the 2021 time series, is that roughly 23.3% higher. So it is a big jump at the national level. And that's about the increase numerically is 185,600 people. So I was asked by the QFCC to just break it down a little bit for states and territories. So you can see the 2016 ERP, so the estimate made by the ABS for 2016, 2021, the increase between the two and the proportional change. And what stands out there is the proportional increase for Victoria being 36.2%, which is a big jump for those guys down there and will have a big impact on their reporting. But the largest numerical jumps are retained by the 2 largest states with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations of New South Wales with 74,000 and Queensland with 52,000 additional residents. So this is another way, sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit, but I want to emphasise. So this is another way of looking at the changes and potential impacts. So the darker bars here is from the 2016 census projection series for 2021. So this is what is in the current time series that we're using in the darker charts, and then the lighter colours is the additional residents that have been captured in the population at the national level. And you can see there that the largest differences are in those school-age cohorts. So 5 to 14-year-olds in particular. And if we break that down by states and territories, again, the 10 to 14-year-olds are seeing, so this is the excess between the projection and the new estimate for states and territories by those age groups. So the 10 to 14-year-olds are seeing the largest differences in general across all jurisdictions, possibly, except the ACT, that's right. And the proportional differences for the jurisdictions, if you look in the top right corner, because that's where all the action is, that's New South Wales and Victoria with increases of over 20%. So that's big jump and likely to impact on the data that will be reported for of high interest for this group in terms of child deaths and mortality. A different way to look at this, the populations, is to follow a cohort through. So taking the 0 to 4-year-olds in 2016 that were counted by states and territories and looking at how many 5 to 9-year-olds there were in 2021, 5 years later. And again, you can see for New South Wales and Queensland in particular, big jumps in that same cohort, which is probably reflecting that increased propensity to identify, or people changing their identification, or in this case, probably their children's identification. So we've also seen these increases happening in administrative data sets in Queensland. So on the left, we have live births, which is different to registered births because it doesn't include late registrations and things like that. So we're looking at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander live births recorded by Queensland Health, which are up over 25%. And on the right are the school FTE enrolments from Schools Australia, and again, up over 20%. So we're seeing growth in these cohorts in other administrative data, which is supporting this growth in the population. So I'll hand over to Edwin now for the potential impacts.
Thanks, Ross. Like Ross mentioned, these increases in population estimates have a direct impact on service delivery planning and reporting. In some cases, they may cause a shift in the narrative around particular issues relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population outcomes. I'll briefly run through some examples from the reporting our team typically works on to illustrate this point. So one example is the death rates for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in Queensland. We have used a single year's worth of data instead of the usual 5-year average to account, usually to account for small numbers, just to illustrate the point here. The new rates are shown in the lighter colored circles and are generally lower than those based off the 2016 base census projections for 2021. This was also similar with child safety substantiation rates by age groups, where the rates were smaller for those using the larger population estimates as the new denominators, which are shown in the gold bar. And the impact is more pronounced in the 5 to 9 and 10 to 14-year-old age groups because of the change in age structure that Ross pointed out earlier. Another example we've put here just to demonstrate the point or the impact of this change in age structure from the new estimates on a whole of population age standardized crime rate that we usually report on. And this change is shown by the downward shift in the small circle in the top right, which is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander rate for 2021. In time series data such as this, the entire time series will actually shift with the release of the new population estimates and projections. And it's quite likely that the rate ratios comparison with the non-Indigenous population will also be affected, given that the shift in the non-Indigenous rate shown on the bottom right has not been as drastic as the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population age just standardized rates. And another outcome, so for outcomes with the proportion based on an ERP, such as target 3 of closing the gap shown on the slide here, the impact of the increase in population is more direct. For example, the published rate the published proportion, for 2021 for Queensland was 95.1 for target 3, which shows this target to be on track and potentially met for Queensland. However, the proportion drops to around 91%, so a bit below the 95% target when the new estimates of 4-year-olds were used to calculate this corresponding proportion. We do know that this estimate is just an experimental estimate that we created to demonstrate the potential impact of an increase of this magnitude for our reporting, as the official year before full-time schooling cohort for 2021 using the new estimates has not yet been released. Other states and territories with large increases in the 0 to 4-year-old population estimates for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population will also likely see similar shifts in their outcomes. To wrap up, reporting that uses time series of estimates and projections for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population will need recalculating, and this will include some of the data currently published for closing the gap targets. There will be some good news indicators where higher denominator results in a lower rate or proportion, for example, incarceration, offending, and youth justice outcomes. While for others, the change will appear less positive, for example, participation in preschool education outcome as shown on this slide here. We also have a list of key dates for upcoming releases in this space, so we expect to see the final estimate of the 2021 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population based on the 2021 census around August this year. And in November, we should hopefully see the live tables for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, which will be a key input to their estimates and projections, which we expect to come up around the third quarter of next year. And lastly, we've just got a slide of key sources of data that were used to inform this presentation, mainly from the ABS. So thank you.
Both so much for that. I think with the closing the gap is such a significant priority for us. It'll be important for us to get this right. So thank you so much. Now that brings us on to the last question and answer session for the day. So if we just invite everyone back into that. Awesome. In terms of, and kind of kick off with probably the hard question, James, when do you kind of see it starting to impact us, all the teams that are with ICD-11? What kind of timeframes are you working towards? Do you think it'll be the next couple of years?
It's not going to be the next couple of years. So at the moment, there is a task force that was formed by the AHW, and so there are representatives there, obviously from the Institute, but the ABS as well, and the Independent Hospital Pricing Authority, and other jurisdictions involved. It's a big task to implement, and especially the infrastructure. Where Australia has a very well-developed health information system, the amount of effort required to actually make those changes is going to be significant, perhaps more so though for morbidity than mortality. And while we will definitely have requirements where we need to make sure that the classification is ready for us, that we have things like auto-coding tools available, they are progressively becoming available, and the international community is now working to start to put together those plans. If I had to put a timeline to it, our UK colleagues only a couple of weeks ago showed us a project plan that saw ICD-11 implemented around about 2027 in the UK. We'll see how we're going. But yes, we've definitely got a little while yet. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't be investing in the time in making sure it's ready for us and we can get the most out of it.
Would you say the UK are in front of us at this point in time?
Oh, never. No, no. No. I mean, they're doing very well. They have got good support for their project plan, and I think we'd like to be in that same position, but we've got a few more things we need to get in place before we can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And over to you, into Roz and Edwin, in terms of the closing the gap targets and obviously the reporting that goes along with that. how do you think it's going to play out around consistency of reporting some of these issues? Do you think which agency do you think owns that in terms of making sure there's consistent messaging around the shifts in rates as a result of the census changes? Is that ABS? Obviously, you have a role within Queensland, but obviously explaining that difference to the public will take a bit of effort for people to understand why rates would have shifted so much.
Yep, so the Productivity Commission has carriage of that at the national level, and we've certainly communicated with them the importance of making sure that there's a very clear narrative around the reasons for the shift, because it's very disconcerting to have people think that a target's been met to only subsequently been told that we've changed the numbers and it's no longer been met. So the Productivity Commission, we've been assured it has that well in train, but they obviously haven't received the numbers yet to even start to apply them to the data set. So it's going to be interesting, and the ABS is going to have a key role in that, in supporting them through that.
And some of the narrative around like differences with some regional rates and where some of the shift has occurred mainly, how do you see that playing out with, in terms of some of that kind of gap narrowing with some of the regions?
Sorry, no, so we'll only have the populations at the state and territory level. So we're actually going to, it's going to be quite difficult. At the sub-state level, the ABS only releases the census year estimates. And there will be some remoteness regions, but only at the national level. So up until now, unless they're choosing to do something different. So really, as regional as we can get is the state and territory at the moment. But again, that I'm very aware that the ABS is pushing to try and move towards annual estimates for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. It's an aspiration, but one we would support if they can get that methodology right to try and then work down to sub-state.
Yep. Just picking up on some questions that are in the chat, and specifically for Edwin regarding slide 17, and sorry, I can't, it's very specific. Good that Queensland 0 to 4 years estimated death rate will have fallen, but slide 13 with New South Wales and Victoria denominators have risen more. Their death rates will fall further, leaving Queensland further behind. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that. Yeah, so as part of that, the baseline, so the Productivity Commission is going to have to recalculate all of the baseline data that the closing the gap is then measured against as well. So I'm just trying to.
All right, here.
If you go to that one.
Yeah, I think generally there's a lot of mentioning about it's good to see adjusted data and more transparency on some of the reporting requirements, particularly around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people. And I suppose a question for both of you, I suppose there's so much thirst for knowledge and data and I suppose transparency in data, and I suppose both being quite different things, but will, I suppose, improve data reporting moving forward and having better information available. I think the ICD-11 hopefully will give us ability to do much more thorough data analysis for us. So I think, do you think we'll stay up to date enough? Do you feel like the data, the thirst for knowledge and the immediacy of which when people want to receive information has kind of certainly increased over time? And so do you think that we'll get enough information out there quick enough to kind of stay on top of this?
Yeah. We're certainly aiming to get data out as quickly as we can in Queensland.
But we're so conscious of quality as well. Obviously, such a keen interest in the population, we do really want to make sure that any estimates and the results that we do publish actually is rigorous enough to be defensible in the public eye.
Absolutely. Okay, and I think that's all the questions that we have today. So I am actually going to wrap up now. So thank you both to Edwin, Roslyn and James for your presentations and certainly taking part in the questions and answer sessions. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Look, on behalf of the Queensland Family and Child Commission and the ANZ Child Death Review and Prevention Group, I'd like to thank all of the presenters today for their insightful presentations and taking the time for sharing their knowledge and expertise. Thank you to all our participants for joining. I hope you have found it to be a valuable experience. I'd like to thank my team who have worked tirelessly to kind of get this up and running and organising all the conference. Apart from a few technology glitches, which I think is inevitable in this kind of online world, I'd like to think it's gone relatively smoothly. So thank you so much. Today's sessions have been recorded and they will be available to view at a later date, and we will make sure that we'll share that in the next couple of days. And so that concludes the conference, and thank you and goodbye.